You've seen this scene before. A family on TV, a child diagnosed with something terrible. Doctors give little hope. The parents pray. Thousands of strangers pray. Then, against all odds, the child survives. The mother weeps on camera and says the word that always comes next: miracle. And nobody questions it. Nobody, because in that moment, questioning feels cruel. And this is how miracles survive. Not because the evidence is strong, but because the emotion is. And Spinoza saw that mechanism with brutal clarity long before modern television ever put it on display. This video is about one of the most powerful arguments ever made against miracles. It was built by Baruch Spinoza in the 17th century. It is so structurally clean that few responses have ever really confronted its deepest premise. And it starts with a question most miracle believers have never been forced to answer. Before you can defend miracles, you need to understand what a miracle actually claims. Strip away the emotion, the reverence, the childhood conditioning, and look at the bare logical structure. A miracle is an event in which the laws of nature are violated by a supernatural agent. Water does not spontaneously become wine. Dead tissue does not spontaneously reassemble. These require something outside nature to override the rules. Now follow that implication. If a miracle can occur, then the laws of nature are not really laws. They're suggestions. They're local rules that a higher authority can overrule whenever it sees fit. And that means the universe is not a coherent system. It's a system with a backdoor, a system where anything can happen at any time if the right entity decides to step in. Remember that image. A universe with a backdoor. We're going to come back to it. Spinoza saw that this doesn't just threaten religion. It threatens knowledge itself. If natural laws can be suspended, you cannot rely on anything. You cannot trust gravity. You cannot trust chemistry. You cannot trust that the sun rises tomorrow, because the back door could open at any moment and change the rules. The very possibility of science, of reliable, repeatable knowledge about the world, collapses. This is where Spinoza's argument gets its teeth. In his system, God and nature are the same thing. God is the totality of existence, operating by necessary laws. A miracle would require God to act against himself, the infinite substance violating its own structure, contradicting its own nature. And that, Spinoza says, is logically incoherent. An infinite being cannot contradict itself. A perfect order cannot produce disorder. Now watch what this does to the traditional argument. Believers say, miracles prove God's power. God is so mighty that even nature bows to his will. Spinoza inverts this completely. If God created nature and then keeps breaking its rules, you are saying God's creation was defective. You are saying the designer built a system that doesn't work properly and has to keep reaching in to fix it. A universe that needs constant supernatural patching is a universe designed by an incompetent engineer. A universe of unbroken natural law, a universe without a backdoor, is the only one worthy of the name divine. The miracle believer, Spinoza argues, is the one insulting God. But here comes the strongest religious objection, and it deserves serious weight. Many theologians would argue, miracles don't break God's order. They reveal a deeper order. They show that God is not bound by the regularities we observe. A miracle is not an error in the system, it's an expression of a freedom beyond our comprehension. Spinoza's response is devastating in its simplicity. If God's actions transcend the laws we observe, then we can know nothing about God's actions. Every event becomes potentially miraculous. The concept loses all content, because a word that explains everything explains nothing. If miracles are everywhere, they are nowhere. If anything can be secretly supernatural, natural law becomes meaningless. You have an elevated God. You've installed a back door so wide that the entire wall collapses. and the moment understanding becomes impossible, the only thing left is submission, which, Spinoza noticed, is exactly what the institutions selling miracles are looking for. And this is where Spinoza pivots from metaphysics to institutional power. Because here's the question that rarely gets asked: why do religious institutions promote miracles? Think carefully. Every major religion has a miracle at its foundation. Christianity, the resurrection. Islam, the revealed Quran. Judaism, the parted sea. These aren't incidental. They're load-bearing walls. A miracle is the ultimate credential. If your prophet performed miracles, your prophet speaks for God. If your prophet speaks for God, your institution speaks for God. If your institution speaks for God, then questioning it means questioning God himself. The miracle is the mechanism that converts doubt into obedience. Spinoza recognized that the prophets of the Hebrew Bible were not scientists or philosophers. They were men with powerful imaginations and limited analytical tools who interpreted natural events as divine interventions because they had no other framework. Thunder was God's anger. Plague was God's punishment. A rainbow was God's promise. Not because these things carried supernatural meaning, but because the people experiencing them couldn't explain them any other way. And religious institutions have a direct material interest in keeping it that way. The moment you explain the thunder, you don't need the priest. The moment you understand the plague, you don't need the prophet. The moment natural law accounts for the rainbow, the covenant dissolves. Think about the economics. A religion without miracles competes on ideas alone. It has to persuade through reason, through ethical argument, through the quality of its community. A religion with miracles has a shortcut. It can bypass reason entirely. The miracle is the trump card that ends all debate. And once you've established that your institution has access to the back door, to the place where the rules of the universe bend on command, you don't need to argue anymore. You just need to remind people that God is on your side and not theirs. Spinoza understood that this was not incidental to religion, it was structural. Remove miracles, and you don't reform the institution. You dissolve its authority at the root. This is why some religious authorities of his era saw Spinoza's ideas as corrosive enough to warrant excommunication. His challenge to miracles didn't target one doctrine, it threatened a key mechanism by which religious authority operates. You can reform theology, you can modernize worship, but you cannot remove miracles without removing the institution's claim to speak for God. That's not a reform, that's a dissolution. If this investigation into the machinery behind miracles is landing for you, subscribe, because what comes next connects ancient prophets to modern billion-dollar industries. Now look at the modern miracle economy. Consider the pilgrimage industry around Lourdes, France, where several million people travel every year hoping for a cure. Since 1858, thousands of cures have been reported, but the Catholic Church has officially recognized only around 70 miracles. The rate is vanishingly small, but the industry doesn't run on miracles actually happening. It runs on people believing they might. Hotels, souvenir shops, bottled spring water. The economy of Lourdes depends on hope, not evidence. Or consider the pattern visible in some faith-healing ministries across the United States. A stage, a crowd, a hand on the forehead, a declaration of healing. The cameras roll. What rarely gets shown. The follow-up. The conditions that return. The adrenaline that fades. The money that stays gone. To give one example of scale, the ministry of Benny Hinn reportedly brought in roughly $89 million in donations in a single year. That kind of revenue doesn't depend on verified outcomes. It depends on the promise that the backdoor is real and that someone on that stage has the key. These patterns aren't marginal. Surveys consistently showed that a significant share of Americans believe God can intervene or heal in supernatural ways. Globally, religious tourism is an industry estimated at over $250 billion and projected to keep growing. This isn't fringe belief. This is a mainstream economy built on the premise that the laws of nature have a back door and that certain people, places, and institutions hold the key. The mechanism is identical to what Spinoza diagnosed centuries ago: ignorance, maintained and monetized. When someone recovers from illness, the recovery is attributed to prayer, not the surgical team, the decades of pharmaceutical research, or the resilience of the immune system. When a disaster spares one family, it's called divine protection, not probability. When a coincidence aligns with a wish, it's called a sign, not confirmation bias. The pattern repeats across centuries. Something happens that the person cannot immediately explain. Rather than sitting with not knowing, rather than saying, "I don't understand the cause yet," they reach for the supernatural. The gap in knowledge becomes the back door through which the miraculous enters. Spinoza called this the Asylum of Ignorance. The phrase deserves to be famous because it names a mechanism that is alive and well right now. The Asylum of Ignorance is the place people retreat to when reality becomes too complex, too impersonal, too indifferent to tolerate. And the institutions that profit from that retreat have every reason to keep the asylum open and well-funded. This is the thread that connects ancient miracle stories to modern pseudoscience and conspiracy thinking. The mechanism is identical: something I can't explain, therefore something supernatural, or something secretly controlled, must be responsible. The gap in my knowledge has to be filled, not with patience, not with investigation, with an agent, a will, a plan. Because the alternative, that things just happen, that causes are impersonal, that the universe doesn't organize itself around human significance, is intolerable. A weeping statue of Virgin Mary and a conspiracy theory about a rigged election operate on the same logical architecture. Both start with a gap. Both fill the gap with an intentional agent. Both refuse the possibility that the explanation is impersonal, statistical, or simply not yet available. The Asylum of Ignorance doesn't discriminate between sacred and secular. It houses anyone who cannot bear to say, "I don't know." Consider how this plays out in ordinary life. A friend narrowly avoids a car accident and posts online, "God was watching over me today." Think about what that implies. God intervened to protect one commute, but not for the hundreds of thousands of traffic fatalities every year? Spinoza would say, that's not God. That's a projection, a coping mechanism, a way to feel significant in a universe that offers no guarantees and has no backdoor. A weeping statue of Virgin Mary, a televised healing, a tumor that shrank, a plane crash with survivors. In every case, the same move. I can't explain it, so something beyond nature must be responsible. Spinoza traced this chain with unnerving clarity, and once you see it everywhere, not just in religion, in every system that profits from your discomfort with uncertainty. So what replaces miracles? What do you get when you close the back door? You get a universe that doesn't need to cheat. Quarks assemble into atoms, atoms into molecules, molecules into cells, cells into organisms capable of contemplating their own existence. No violation of natural law required, no supernatural intervention. Just the relentless, elegant unfolding of structure from structure, complexity from simplicity, consciousness from matter, all of it following rules that have never once been broken. Spinoza understood that the demand for miracles is, at its root, a failure of awe. People who need the supernatural have stopped being amazed by the natural. They've become so numb to the actual mechanics of existence that they require the laws of physics to shatter in order to feel something. But look at what unbroken laws actually produce: the complexity of a single cell, the mathematics of gravitational waves, the improbability that you exist, not because God chose you, but because an unbroken chain of causes, stretching back billions of years, produced the exact configuration of matter now watching this video. That is not a miracle. That is something more radical than a miracle. That is a universe that doesn't cheat and produces you anyway. And this is what Spinoza was really protecting, not skepticism. Wonder. A more adult form of wonder, one that doesn't need the universe to break its own rules in order to feel awe. A miracle says, the rules failed. Spinoza says, the rules are so deep, so productive, so endlessly generative, that they never needed to fail. That's the choice. A universe that cheats, that breaks its rules on demand, plays favorites, rewards prayer, and punishes doubt. Or a universe that is honest, that operates with total consistency, produces unimaginable complexity through law alone, and doesn't care about you, but includes you in something infinite. The mother on the news program, weeping over her child's recovery? Her relief is real, her gratitude is real, but the word she used, miracle, closes a door. It stops the investigation. It says, no further explanation needed. And in doing so, it erases the doctors, the researchers, and the billions of hours of accumulated human knowledge that actually produced the outcome. The miracle doesn't just misname the cause. It replaces real heroes with a backdoor that was never there. Humans reach for miracles because they cannot tolerate the alternative. They cannot bear a universe that doesn't organize itself around their needs. Spinoza could. Einstein could. And the question for you is whether you can sit with a cosmos that offers no backdoor, no exceptions, no comfort, only the staggering, impersonal, magnificent fact that it works. Once you stop looking for the miraculous, you might finally notice the extraordinary, which was there all along, hiding in plain sight, in a universe that never once needed to cheat.